Well, hello, life science. So this is a bit of an unusual weekend because it's Mother's Day, and that means that I have to take pretty much all of Sunday off, which means that I really only have this time right now to make a video to be ready on Monday. So as unusual as it is, hey, here I am. I still got my teacher brain with me and my teacher mouth and, the teacher face. So I can still make a teacher video. And it's going to be good. It's going to be good. You're going to watch me not die, and it's going to be good. All right. Anyway, we are still talking about animals, but we are actually going to be moving out of the invertebrates. We talked about invertebrates that were marine invertebrates, like sponges, porifera and odaria. We talked about invertebrates that were worms, annelids, the flatworms, the roundworms. We talked about insects and arthropods, and we went through a whole bunch of creepy, crawly stuff with exoskeletons and goopy insides and so not the most pet store variety of animals, but we're going to get there. And in order to get there, the first thing that we need to do is grow a backbone. No, I don't mean that we need to be brave and put our minds to it. I mean that we need to just go to animals that have backbones. So those animals are going to be called chordates. They're part of a phylum called Chordata, and those would be animals with what is called a central nervous system. So we get to the next slide here. We have some terminology that we need to be familiar with. First of all, vertebrae. Vertebrae are bones. They are the bones that make up, like the bones in the back of your neck and that run down the center of your back. They make up your backbone, and they have a little hollow, well, I shouldn't say a hollow hole, that makes no sense. They are hollow in that they have a hole. They're like ring-shaped, and through that hole, a spinal cord, actual nervous tissue, can run through it. So think of it almost like a tube of flexible bone armor that goes around a spinal cord. So speaking of spinal cord, let's talk about a notochord. So a notochord is not quite a spinal cord. It's a rod of tough, flexible material that runs the length of a creature's body, and it provides the majority of its support. That kind of cord is going to be in some chordates, though not all. So you don't have one. Don't freak out, though. You're not supposed to. The last one is a dorsal nerve cord. This is protected either by vertebrae or a notochord. So your vertebrae and your notochord are two different versions of protecting a central nervous system. All right? So we're going to go to the next slide here, and we're going to talk about specific kinds of chordates. If Chordata is a phylum, underneath of that we would have a class, although not having all the creatures able to fit into kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Yeah, I got that. Sometimes we need to have different steps along the way. So we're going to have a subphylum, and this subphylum is called Urochordata. So what's in Urochordata? One good example of a urochordate is called a sea squirt. So a sea squirt is also called a tunicate, and it's because its body is covered in something that almost resembles a tunic. We can imagine it's wearing a hoodie built into its body, and it secretes that as an adult. It kind of resembles a tadpole in its larval stage, and has both a dorsal nerve cord and a notochord. So that means it has no vertebrae, right? It's not, it doesn't have a backbone like we have. It has instead that kind of firm covering over its dorsal nerve cord. It swims around for a brief period, then it attaches itself to something on the bottom of the sea, and become anchored and sessile there. Anyway, so that's a sea squirt. One of the next slide. Sea squirts develop into their adult form. Remember, we're talking about it swim. It would swim in its larval stage, and as an adult, it anchors to the ground. And in its adult form, the nerve cord and the notochord are recycled to form new tissues. So, like for example, organs rotate so that the oral and aerial openings are now upward. Its whole body transforms, and at that point, it's kind of similar to a sponge. So, if you needed to think what is a sea squirt like, think of it almost as if it were a sponge with the life cycle of a jellyfish, but the nerve cord of a vertebrate. Yeah, sea squirts. Good fun. Anyway, next up. Next subphylum that we're going to look at is called subphylum Chordata. Now, we encountered the root cephala before when we were talking about the cephalothorax as a body segment in some arthropods. Remember, insects have a head and a thorax and an abdomen. Well, the body segments of some arthropods, like crustaceans and arachnids, are a combined, or maybe I should say fused, head and thorax called a cephalothorax. Now, the root cephala means head, so Chordata is going to have something to do with nerve cord and the animal's head. So let's figure out what that is. So the creature that we're going to look at in this is called a lancelet. Kind of sounds like Lancelot, Knight of the Round Table, but apparently it's just lancelet. So it's less than 3 inches long. So I'm picturing it in my head almost like it's a sardine. It has less sophisticated sensory organs, and it usually stays buried in sand. The way that it eats is it filters plankton out of the water. Next slide. Still talking about its feeding habits. So it draws water into its mouth with cilia. You remember cilia, even like on a sponge, the collar cells had cilia. They had flagella. Flagella and cilia are kind of similar, but the cilia are smaller and more numerous. So its mouth has some cilia that draw water into it, kind of like the flagella of sponge collar cells draw water into it. And then it filters that water through these oral structures called cirri, which, if you had to think about what those are, think about them almost like a filter, almost like you might think of like the baleen in whales. It's something that it uses to catch all the gunk out of the water that it intends to eat. So it will clean out the large indigestible debris as well. Okay, so the water's going to pass through the slits, and that traps food in there, and it digests that food in the gut. So it's a filter feeder. Water is going to flow out into the atrial cavity, and then that leaves the body through what's called an atriochord. All those details, kind of irrelevant. Really, all you need to know is it feeds in a fairly sponge-like fashion by filtering water that it draws into itself with, in the sponge's case, flagella, but in the lancelet's case, it's cilia. And see, that's my demonstration of flagella versus cilia. And it filters the food out of that water, gets rid of the gunk, eats the food, and dispenses of its waste. That's the lancelet, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we've had 2 different subphyla of Chordata that have no vertebrae. They have a notochord, which is like I'm almost like picturing plastic instead of metal, like hard but still kind of flexible and breakable. It is a protective sheath over their dorsal nerve cord. Remember, dorsal is in the back, you do have dorsal nerve cord, but they have a notochord to protect it. This next subphylum, Vertebrata, is going to actually have vertebrae, as its name suggests. Alright, so let's get into subphylum Vertebrata. Next slide. So these are called vertebrates. We belong to this group. They have a notochord during their early development. So like, before you're born, or if you're in an egg before you hatch. And it turns into a true backbone before, like I said, either being born or hatching. They also have what's called an endoskeleton. Now remember, we talked about exoskeleton when we were in the arthropod section. Now we have the opposite of that. It is an endoskeleton, and that is a skeleton that is on the inside of a creature's body, kind of like we have. Exactly like we have. And it's typically composed either of bone or of cartilage. We'll get into the specific differences between bone and cartilage in just a bit, but for now, we actually have creatures with inner skeletons. So we had creatures with no skeletons, invertebrates. Some of those creatures had their own structural systems, like sponges had spongin, but then they also had spicules in order to have their structure. Some invertebrates, like corals, made their own structures, and mollusks make shells. Well, arthropods with an exoskeleton made of chitin, that's another way to have structure in your body. This last form of structure, and I really mean last, because at this point we've encountered all the ways that animals have structure in their bodies. We've got an endoskeleton, and it's either going to be made of cartilage or of bone. Okay, so let's get on with the vertebrates. What is a bone? So this is kind of funny, because when we grow up learning about the human body, we tend to think of bones almost like they're not alive. Like we think, or maybe this is just me, I don't know if this is the impression that you have, but when I think of stuff on my body that's alive, I'm like, okay, skin's alive because when it cuts, it bleeds, and it's kind of like squishy and warm, stuff comes out of it. It's alive, right? And then I think about muscles. Okay, those are alive because they do things, they do work. But when I think about bones, I almost think like they're the frame of my body, or at least this is how I thought about it growing up. Almost like when you're watching a building getting constructed and you can see the metal frame. That's how I thought of bones, and it kind of took me a while to realize that bones are just as much alive as any other part of your body, and it's kind of to realize that every individual bone is technically an organ, right? So if you think about what an organ is, it's just a bunch of different tissue types that are all integrated into one structure performing a single task. That's what bones are. It's a bunch of different tissues. Anyway, let's talk about some of those different tissues, some of those different cell types that are in bones. So first of all, bones are living cells that are surrounded by a hard bone matrix. So one kind of cell that is in bones are called osteoblasts. Now, osteoblasts promote the formation of bone tissue by producing the bone matrix itself. Bone matrix totally sounds like an awesome name for an action movie or something, but it's not, unfortunately. So we'll talk about what the bone matrix is in just a second. So osteoblasts promote the formation of bone tissue by producing bone matrix. Osteocytes are mature bone cells that are surrounded by the bone matrix. So osteoblasts produce bone matrix to promote the formation of bone tissue, such as osteocytes, which are mature bone cells in that bone matrix that the osteoblasts have made. We've also got osteoclasts. So osteoclasts break down bone tissue for reshaping or harvesting minerals. Clast is part of a root of a word that means broken, In fact, there's even a kind of sedimentary rock called a clastic rock. It's because it's made of broken fragments. So osteoblasts produces, osteoclasts break down, and osteocytes are the mature bone cells that are in the bone matrix. All right, next slide here. So we've got a couple different types of bone tissue. So those are different types of bone cells. Different cells make up a tissue. So here are some bone tissues. Bone tissues themselves are collagen mixed with calcium salts. Collagen is a protein, it's a structural protein, and calcium salts, obviously, those are just minerals. So like when you think about bone health, you probably think about stuff like calcium, like, you know, drink milk and eat dairy for your bone health. The reason that you need to do that is so that there is a sufficient supply of calcium salts to produce the hardness in your bones, and that is basically a mineral fortification of collagen. All right, so what you've got with bone tissue, there's one that's called compact. Now, compact bone tissue are those collagen fibers, remember that's a protein, that are packed together tightly, forming a hard, tough structure that can withstand strong shocks. There's a secret to being able to absorb shocks that I learned from my friend who makes Japanese style swords. Like he studied under like a samurai sword expert, and he learned how to make samurai swords. Like, no kidding. And you can make iron into steel by mixing carbon with it. The more carbon you add, the harder the steel is. Iron itself is actually kind of soft as far as metals go. So here's the secret to making a sharp sword. See, if you make your sword out of really soft iron, then, or really soft steel, then it's going to lose its edge, right? It's not going to be able to stay sharp. This is a bit awkward. Here we go. It's not going to be able to stay sharp under repeated blows, because if it's soft, it's going to change its shape after it gets hit. Okay, so you can't have a soft sword that stays sharp. So let's try a hard sword. Make it out of high carbon steel. Okay, well then it will keep its shape. But do you know what will happen when you hit it? It will break. Because when you give up softness for hardness, you give up resiliency. Can you think of something harder to break by hitting it than clay? I mean, like, you hit clay, it doesn't break, it bends. It absorbs that shock, okay? So it's easy to bend clay. Have you ever bent glass? You can't bend glass, it will only break. But the difference is that glass can be sharp and clay can never be sharp. So if you want to have something that's strong, as in it won't break, but will also keep its sharpness, you would have a mixture of soft and hard. So here's how you do it with the sword. The front edge of the blade is hard, but the back edge of the blade is soft. That way, you're able to make repeated strikes. The front edge keeps its sharpness because it's made out of a very hard material, but the back of it is able to absorb all the shocks because it's soft. Bones are actually kind of similar to that, because collagen as a protein is kind of like spongy and almost like how to describe this, like gummy almost. That's how proteins are. And that by itself is capable of absorbing a lot of shock. But it can't support any weight. So in order to be able to support weight, you need something hard as well. That's where the calcium salts come in. So if you have a collagen fiber network that would be spongy, but it's full of calcium salts that make it hard, you have something which is both strong enough to support your weight, but also soft enough to absorb all your shocks. Anyway, that is bone tissue for you, and we're ready for our next slide. All right, so like I said, I used to have this idea about bones in my head that was erroneous, fancy word for wrong, and that bones are almost just like the metal frame of a building where they weren't alive. And there's also that song, I don't know if you've heard that song, them bones, them dry bones. They're not even dry, right? We think of bones as being dry because when something's been dead for a long time, the bones are all that's left of them, right? So say you've got like, dinosaur fossils, right? All that's left is the bones, and they're very, very dry. We tend to think of bones as being dry. But when they're alive, they're not dry. Of course they're not dry. They contain blood vessels that supply oxygen, nutrients to bone cells so they can grow. I mean, there's blood in your bones. Not only that, but blood is produced in your bones. Marrow is the name of the soft tissue on the inside of bone that produces blood cells. Your red blood cells actually have their origin in your bones. Before I move on, I mentioned dinosaurs and their bones. This is something that is fairly recent in terms of scientific discovery, and I mean that very relatively, because like we've known about dinosaurs for 150 years or something like that, or longer. I don't know quite when the earliest dinosaur discoveries were, but like we knew about them in the 1800s. But something that is, I think this discovery was after the 90s. I think it was in the early 2000s. Some soft tissue was discovered on the inside of some dinosaur bone fossils, which turned out to be not quite as fossilized as we expected. And it turns out that inside of it, even intact collagen fibers have been discovered. Collagen is that protein that's structural to bone, and it is so tough that some of it has survived for more than 65, even 75, or up to 100 million years. I mean, hey, that's pretty tough right there. All right, so enough about those bone tissues. I said that we'd talk about cartilage. Now it's time to talk about cartilage. So cartilage is slightly different. It's not reinforced with calcium salts, so it does have that kind of spongy, rubbery feeling. So yeah, it's weaker, but remember the benefit of not being hard is that you are flexible. And so cartilage is able to serve different purposes to your body. First, it can be connective tissue, almost like, I don't want to say a hinge, but almost like Velcro between two surfaces, right? It will connect those two. Let me be more specific because it ties into another function that it has. They also cushion. So let's take like a joint, so to speak, like in my thumb. See, I got a joint right here. So that means that I have a small bone here and a small bone. Oh, pointing at your own hand is really tricky. There's a small bone here and a small bone there, and they meet in that spot. Every time I bend my finger, if there wasn't a cushion between those two bones, it'd be like grinding against each other, and that would be quite painful. In fact, that condition is called arthritis, and it's common in older people who have worn their bodies out a lot more because they've used it for longer. Excuse me. So cartilage serves the purpose of not only cushioning those two joints but also connecting them. Okay, if you know anything about say pipes fitting together, or maybe even like in the lid of your water bottle, there might be like a little rubber ring on the inside of that ring. that is kind of what cartilage is for your body, connecting your joints together. Oh, by the way, you also have some structures in your body that are entirely cartilage. That would be your ears. Remember that cartilage is soft enough to be flexible, but it also has its own shape. So something like this is a pretty crazy shape, right? To just be skin? I mean, that's impossible. The skin would just be like, just be floppy. So in order to actually have a shape, you need to have cartilage. But if you had an ear bone, every time you went like that bone would break. So cartilage is really the only option. Your nose also is cartilage. Okay, so ears and nose, cartilage, cushion, connect. Yeah, all right. Got all those words out there. So let's move on. We've got some to talk about with the skeleton. So we mentioned that vertebrates have an endoskeleton, and so the vertebrate skeleton basically has all the same structure among all the vertebrates. I mean, they're all descended from a common ancestor. Of course, they would be fairly similar. Some minor differences. So the first part of the skeleton is called the axial skeleton. And this is the portion of the skeleton that supports and protects the head, neck, and trunk. So you can see some bones highlighted in this picture. You've got the skull, obviously, the backbone all the way down to the pelvis, and the rib cage. So think of it as everything but the limbs. Okay? So this would be like the entire skeleton of a snake, basically. Okay, so that's called the axial skeleton. By the way, the backbone is a name for all of the vertebrae singular, all the vertebrae in that stack, okay? There's there's some number, more than 20 vertebrae. I can't remember how many vertebrae the human has, but from the base of your skull all the way down, to the top of your pelvis, those vertebrae make what's called the vertebral column, and that is referred to loosely as your backbone. Okay, so that's your axial skeleton. What about the rest of it? Your appendicular skeleton. I had to work so hard when I first learned that word to learn how to pronounce it, and now it's so fun. Appendicular. It's a good word. Anyway, the appendicular skeleton is the portion of the skeleton that attaches to the axial skeleton and has the limbs attached to it, right? So we've got what's called the pectoral girdle. Your pectoral muscles are these muscles, and so the pectoral girdle would basically be the things sitting here, okay? You've also got the pelvic girdle. Your pelvis is like your hip bone, so it would be the legs and attachments, and also it would be the attached limbs. If you need some help remembering those two terms, I'd suggest this. Axial skeleton sounds like axis, and an axis on a graph is the center lines that everything lines up on, or centers on. So axial is like an axis. Appendicular is similar to the word appendix or appendage. And an appendix is a part of a book that's way in the back that has an index or a glossary or something. That's an appendix. It's something that is stuck on, kind of like your arm is just kind of stuck onto your body. Or if you like an appendage. An appendage is a body part that is kind of stuck on or hanging on. Kind of like an ear could be considered an appendage. Well, your limbs are appendages as well, and since it is the skeleton of your appendages, it's your appendicular skeleton. Cool. All right, next slide. Yeah, I know, that's how I feel about it too. So there are more body systems that are common to basically all life, but most familiar in vertebrates. So if you remember back when we were doing mollusks and we were talking about the snail, one thing that I wanted to point out to you was, okay, yeah, Snails and humans are different. Of course they are. But think about how they're also the same. We both have a mouth and a digestive tract. We both have to have some form of locomotion. We have our eyes and our mouth on our anterior side, like on our head, so to speak. Blood vessels and a way to pump the blood as well. I mean, there are so many ways that we're different, but some ways also in which we are similar. And the similarities are just way easier to see in vertebrates because, well, we're all more closely related. So when I'm talking about the features of vertebrates, I'm not just talking about the features of humans, I'm also talking about the features of many, many animals. Just bear in mind that not all creatures have systems like these. They have systems that perform the same functions because these functions are necessary for animal life, but the way that we're talking about it specifically is like limited to vertebrates. Anyway, the closed circulatory system is opposite of what we had in arthropods. Remember the open circulatory system? In the open circulatory system, I compared that to like a heart kind of like dousing the internal organs with blood and then scooping it back up or like showering it. This one, the blood stays within blood vessels the entire time. Okay? So a closed circulatory system is a circulatory system in which the oxygen-carrying blood cells never leave the blood vessels. It's always contained within blood vessels. So the way this works is there is a heart, which is a central muscular pump, and it pumps blood into arteries. Arteries are blood vessels that lead away from the heart. Then the arteries will branch until blood eventually will reach what are called capillaries, okay? So you got an artery that splits into two smaller arteries and eventually get to the point where it splits into capillaries. And these capillaries, you got billions and billions of them and they're all microscopically small. That is how extreme the branching gets. And it's in the capillaries where the actual oxygen exchange takes place. And then the blood returns through veins, right? So you've got capillaries combined into veins, combined into some very big veins that enter into the heart. Anyway, that's the basic function of a closed circulatory system. Let's talk about capillaries for a second. So capillaries are thin, walled blood vessels. Like I said, they're tiny. They have very thin walls. That's how the gas exchange is able to take place. And it's through those thin walls that the gases actually can exchange. Okay? It's between the cells in the blood and the cells in the body. That's where the gas exchange takes place. Obviously, you're going to have one gas exchange in your lungs where you're picking up oxygen, and you'll have a different gas exchange, say, in your muscles where it might be delivering the oxygen too. Okay, so how is this accomplished? It does it with hemoglobin. Again, I mentioned hemoglobin back when I was talking about mollusks as a point of contrast because a lot of invertebrates don't have hemoglobin. They have something called hemocyanin. So their blood is a different color and it has copper instead of iron. But we're talking about vertebrates, so I guess we're talking about us. Our blood, vertebrate blood, contains hemoglobin as its oxygen delivery system. And that's what makes our blood red. There's a diagram of the chemical structure, and if you see in the center of it, there is an Fe. That is the chemical symbol for iron. So there is an iron atom in the center of a hemoglobin molecule. So yeah, this is the protein that is going to be in red blood cells that carries oxygen, because oxygen is going to bond with that iron just like it does when it turns metal into rust. Okay, so we got a endoskeleton, closed circulatory system. Now let's talk about the nervous system. So the nervous system is the most complex in vertebrates. Other classes, other phyla have nervous systems. You remember the ganglia of earthworms, and their nerve cord, the ganglia of planaria, and all those invertebrates. They have nervous systems, but the nervous system in vertebrates is the most complex nervous system in the animal kingdom. I'm saying they. Should I say we because we are vertebrates, or should I say they? I don't know. Vertebrates have a large, complex brain that is segmented into specialized lobes. In other words, there are areas of the brain that seem to have special functions or capabilities assigned to them or associated with them. So let's talk about some of the lobes in the brain of a vertebrate. First of all, we've got olfactory lobes. Olfactory lobes receive signals from receptors in the nose, so that your olfactory lobe is essentially responsible for your sense of smell. In fact, you could even call it your olfactory sense. It would kind of technically be appropriate. Okay, so how about the cerebrum? That is another part of your brain that integrates all your sensory information, and it coordinates the organism's response. The cerebrum is like most of the of this area of your brain. It's the gray part of it, it integrates all that sensory information and coordinates response. Optic lobes. So if your olfactory lobe went with your sense of smell, then the optic lobe goes with your sense of sight. And they receive signals from receptors in the eyes. Your optic lobe may even still be functional even if your eyes aren't. There are certain kinds of blindness that are caused by a miscommunication between your eyes and your brain, almost like your eyes are unplugged from your brain, so your brain displays no signal, so to speak. But somewhere the eyes malfunction and the brain is actually fine. I think it'd be really awesome if that could be solved with some sort of cybernetic eye that communicates with your brain that, hey, this is a science class, not a science fiction class, so maybe I should get off that subject. Anyway, next slide. So there are a couple other lobes. One lobe is called the cerebellum. This controls involuntary actions and refines muscle movement. Now, an involuntary reaction is one that you do not want. When I say do not want, I'm just literally translating involuntary. Remember, like volunt as in like volunteer, it's just like Latin for want. So if you do something voluntarily, it means you want to do it, or it means you intend to do it. Okay, well, does your body do anything that you don't intend for it to do? So there's two different ways that we might mean that. One way is I wanted it not to, as in you burp at an embarrassing time. You wanted that to not happen. That would be one way we mean involuntary. But what about, say, your heartbeat? Is your heart beating right now? I sure hope so. But if your heart is beating, okay, are you making that happen? Are you controlling that? You're not consciously in control of your heartbeat. It's doing that involuntarily. So obviously, there's a big difference between something being involuntary and you actually wanting it to not happen, because of course you want your heart to beat. You're just not doing it voluntarily. A word on that. There are some body functions that do occur involuntarily, but you are also able to control them. So you're going to hate me for this. because whenever this gets pointed out, it's actually quite annoying. So, fair warning. I'm about to ruin your life, but it's okay. So, one of the things that you do automatically, without thinking about it, is you breathe. And the fact that it didn't occur to you that you've been breathing this entire time is good evidence of that. You're probably very aware of how you're sitting or how you're standing, what your hand is doing, whether you're taking notes or like holding a phone or something, or what your feet are doing. Are you sitting on them? Are they like kind of twitching underneath the desk where you're sitting or the table? You're aware of that. But I don't think that you've been paying attention to the fact that you were breathing for half an hour. You were probably just doing that automatically. But think about it. You're able to breathe. Okay, that was weird, but you gotta demonstrate it. You are able to breathe intentionally, right? You are able to control how you breathe. You're able to do it on purpose. And now that you're thinking about it, it's kind of hard to go back to breathing automatically because your brain took control. I'm sorry. You consciously took control of that breathing. Anyway, I'm going to let that bother you for a minute, and now I'm going to ruin blinking for you. You see, you've been blinking this entire time completely automatically, unless, of course, your eyes were closed, in which case you win at life. You realize that you could just listen to these videos, but the idea is you blink automatically, but you are able to, by the way, I do have eyes. You are able to blink on command, and now that you have, maybe you're having a hard time going back to doing it automatically because you're just thinking about, oh, gotta blink, oh, gotta breathe, gotta blink, gotta breathe. Oh, can you imagine how awful life would be if you constantly had to think of those things? Fortunately, you don't. You have a cerebellum that handles involuntary motions and actions like that. Moving on. The last one on this slide, the medulla oblongata. That coordinates vital functions such as those of the circulatory and respiratory systems, important stuff, and transports signals from the brain to the spinal cord, okay? So think of it like the post office of your brain, because to transport signals from the brain to the spinal cord is how commands from your brain get out to your body, right? The spinal cord would also be where the information from your senses and from your body get into your brain. All right. Anyway, so that's medulla oblongata. Okay, so you can actually tell something about an organism's life, how it lives from its brain, because its most important lobes tend to be larger. In other words, your brain invests more structure and more energy into their function and development. So, like, for example, dogs, they have an incredible sense of smell. Many, many, many times more sensitive than a human's sense of smell. So if you were to compare the olfactory lobe of a human to the olfactory lobe of a dog, you'd find that the olfactory lobe of a dog's brain takes up more space in the dog's brain than the human's olfactory lobe does in the human's brain. On the other hand, dogs and humans are both forward-facing creatures. Our eyes are on the front of our face. Dogs are predatory. Humans, well, I wouldn't exactly say that we're predatory, but we have to be able to judge depth. That's an adaptation for tree-dwelling creatures, to be able to judge depth for jumps. So that's something that monkeys have, and obviously, than we have because we're related. And so visual perception is very important for humans as well as for dogs. We would have a more highly developed was it optical or ocular? I can't remember now. It was the eye part. It was at the eye lobe. Anyway, that got very unscientific real quick. The eye part. Oh my goodness. Anyway, moving on. The brain is also divided into left and right lobes, also called hemispheres. All the lobes except the cerebellum are divided into left and right halves, right? So the lobes tend to control the opposite side of the body. So that means that when you have a sense of touch in this hand, you're going to receive that or process it in this side of your brain. Similarly, if I see something in this eye, I'm going to be processing it mostly on this side of my brain. Okay, that is a funny thing about our brains, how they're kind of like reverse of our body. Okay, so speaking of nervous system and brain, let me get on your nerves real quick. Just kidding, I'm going to talk about nerves. So the spinal cord runs inside the vertebral column, and it sends signals to and from the brain. Okay, the spinal cord is going to be the to and from signal carrier for the brain. So the spinal cord is like one big thing that runs down your back, but like what about your fingertips? What about the rest of your body? Many spinal nerves run out of that spinal cord so that the signals can be sent to the place that the brain intended, right? So let's say your brain wants to tell your feet to move. By the way, you are now in control of your breathing and your blinking. Remember, you control those. All right, moving on. So if you want to send a signal to your foot to move, okay, so your brain is going to generate that signal. It's going to be transported to your spinal cord by your medulla oblongata. It's going to be a signal that travels down your spinal cord, but then it needs to get down to your leg. So a spinal nerve is going to extend out of the spinal cord and eventually reach all the way down your foot so that it can activate those muscles. Right? Sensory nerves, that would be one kind of nerve because it collects and transmits sensory information. It'll transmit signals to the brain from the many receptors in the body, whether they're olfactory or optical or auditory or sensory. Also, motor nerves. They take signals from the brain and send them to the places that they need to go, like moving your foot, like I mentioned a minute ago. Okay, so in our study of life, we've encountered lots of different forms of reproduction. We've got bacteria that just perform binary fission and do mitosis. You've got two cells that are a clone of the original. We've got fungus, fungi that produce spores, whether they're in asci or basidiopores. We've got plants that produce spores, like ferns. We've got plants that do vegetative reproduction, like with runners, or by sprouting plantlets that form roots when they touch the ground. We've got reproduction in animals, like ones that, I forgot about flowers and producing seeds. In animals, we've got planarians that are able to get cut in half and then each half regenerates, and various ways that they're able to lay and fertilize eggs. Well, even among vertebrates, there is a variety of ways of producing, though all of them are sexual, as in they are all the combination of the male and female half of two parents' DNA to form a unique offspring. However, the manner in which the young are developed is going to vary. So there's two different ways that that this can occur. One is internally, and the other is externally. So when we're talking about internal fertilization, we're talking about a process by which the male gametes, the sperm, end up inside the female's body where the eggs are, kind of like how pollen ends up inside the ovary of a flower to fertilize the ovules down there. Or it's going to be external, in which the male and the female both put their gametes outside of their bodies and then they meet there. Those are just the two ways that you can get sperm and egg to meet. It's either inside of a body or outside of a body, and they will do that depending on how that organism is adapted to its environment. For example, living things need to remain, they need to have a steady supply of moisture as they're developing. So if you dwell on land, if you're going to develop outside of water, you're going to need to either be inside of your mother or inside of a shell to retain that moisture. If you're underwater, like fish, that's not necessary, so you're able to do external fertilization. Anyway, we can move on because there are three forms of development when it comes to when an egg has been fertilized. So the first kind, and by the way, these three names are very similar, so pay really close attention to how they're spelled. So the first form is called oviparous. So oviparous development is development that occurs in an egg that is hatched outside the female's body. So basically think of how birds reproduce, okay? You've got an egg that is laid outside the body. The creature develops within that egg while it's outside the body, and then it hatches. So that would be oviparous, okay? Ovi meaning egg, okay? So oviparous development is in an egg outside the mother's body. Okay, this one is the one that every time I try to pronounce it, I end up saying viv a few too many times. Ovoviviparous. 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 Man, I can say appendicular. I can say medulla oblongata. Ovoviviparous. That's tricky. Okay, so ovoviviparous development is development that occurs in an egg that is hatched inside the female's body. So this is obviously less common, something that we're not really familiar with, but there are examples of it in which the female has eggs inside of its body and they hatch while they're still inside her body. So that means that like when she gives birth, it's to live young rather than to unhatched eggs. Okay, the last one is viviparous. So oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. Woo! Vivid has to do with like vivacious or vitality. It is life. So viviparous just means like alive, as in like born alive. And that development is development that occurs inside the female, like inside the mother, which allows the offspring to gain nutrients and vital substances from the mother through what's called a placenta. Most mammals develop like this. Okay, so the way that mammals usually do it, viviparous. The way that birds do it, oviparous. You're either laid in an egg and you develop in the egg outside the mother's body. That's oviparous. Viviparous is where you develop entirely within your mother's body. And then there is that cross between them where you start out in an egg, but that egg hatches while you're still in your mother's body. And that's called ovoviviparous. Yeah. Really hard to pronounce. Anyway, that's actually going to be the end of this for now. We talked about bones. We talked about the skeletal system. We talked about a few different kinds of chordates that don't have skeletal systems, like lanceolate, and tunicates. We talked about the skeletal system. We talked about body systems common to chordates vertebrates, which would be a closed circulatory system, a nervous system, and the various parts of those, like how a vertebrate's central nervous system is arranged and designed, and also various forms of reproduction, including the difference between internal and external, and then the difference between oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous development. Whew. Okay, that is an awful lot. But part of the reason that so much of this is in here is because I want to be able to get to a couple different things. One, I need to set up the rest of the vertebrates, because from this point on, the only animals we have to look at are vertebrates. Just fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. All of them are vertebrates. And so this basically set up all of those creatures. We don't need to talk about the specifics of an amphibian versus a reptile versus a mammal's body structure, because they basically have the same body structure. They're all vertebrates. The differences are mostly in how their specific organs, like their skin, are adapted to their environments. And also some differences in their nervous systems, obviously, but also in their circulatory systems. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. Point is, we're set up to do vertebrates, and we just had a lot about bones, so our lesson tomorrow is going to be about specific bones in the vertebrate endoskeleton, and that one is going to be one that I'll see you for. So, have a good rest of the day. Yeah. I don't know why I feel the need to end these videos all dramatically. I'm done now. Bye.